Before I begin, I want to be completely transparent and say that I requested and received a review copy of Wanted Dead from publisher 110 Industries, and that, despite ample time, I think much of what I'm about to say has been discussed far better by everyone who joined me for the Wanted Dead cast, which I've linked to in the description. But hopefully you enjoy this, and I have something new to add, even after all this time.
Detective.
So, I want to start this by saying that I'm probably the target audience for a game like Wanted Dead. It's exactly the kind of hard-on-its-sleeve, straight-to-the-point action game I naturally gravitate to, and that puts me in one of the strangest positions I've been in on the channel, trying to earnestly criticize a game that's a complete write-off for many, while also being as candid as possible. It's a weird one to talk about, because it's a game purposely trying to harken back to the cult classics of the 6th generation. I imagine so much of my criticism could be waved aside as features, not bugs, but I think there's some deeper problems holding this game back from becoming some kind of underrated gem. And to gain a fuller understanding of the game, I decided to play through its spiritual predecessor, Devil's Third, just to see how many of the ideas present there had carried onward into this. The two games share much of the same DNA. From their teams, Devil's Third developer Valhalla Studios would eventually merge to make Salil, the developers of Wanted Dead, to their incarcerated tattooed protagonists, and for the main focus of this video, their attempt to blend third-person shooting and melee action together. While Wanted Dead has some serious flaws that need addressing, I think there's some fundamental problems present way back in 2015 that still haven't been addressed. The most basic being that it's selling itself as a hybrid shooter/action game where neither side complements the other. In looking at the gameplay here, something that's really helped shape my basic understanding of these games is an interview with director Tomonobu Itagaki promoting Devil's Third, saying, "With Devil's Third, I wasn't interested in simply making another shooter like all the others out there, but I knew that I still needed to follow the basic rules of shooter games to please fans of the genre. Therefore, I considered this game to be backwards compatible. This game has everything you'd expect of a modern shooter, but on top of this I've added in melee combat, hand-to-hand fighting, which I've used all my experience to design. And this idea of these games' combat being backwards compatible, seemingly designed as shooters first with the melee combat layered on top of it, well, you can certainly feel it. Levels are either so small that you can just cut through most enemies with little effort going for the melee route, or disengage entirely and just shoot anyone trying to cut you down. This incompatibility might be further explained by the fact that the basis for this house style is from what ended up being a multiplayer-focused title. I'm reminded of some of the same problems that I felt Titanfall 2 ran into. Having to retroactively design around some elements that probably worked well against a human player, but not so much against AI opponents. Your range of offensive options overkill against the shooting gallery nature of most of the threats here. And like Titanfall 2 or Call of Duty, the solution that Devil's Third used to some success was by including a number of bespoke scenarios and set pieces used to mask the limitations of the mechanics. Hard to notice some of the same issues here when you're suddenly fighting hordes of zombies or working your way through a room wired full of explosives. In contrast, Wanted Dead is almost entirely made up of combat arenas where you'll really be forced to see the mechanics. Room after room of enemies, and whose only breaks are so removed from the core mechanics that they just end up being these flat interludes. It might sound strange, but the mechanical focus here is probably why I felt that schism in the gameplay was so much more prominent during my time with Wanted Dead. Minor annoyances adding up and taking center stage. For example, you'll spend most of your time shooting, aiming down sights, and not aggressively hip-firing. It's a stop-and-start feel that makes the two systems feel even farther apart. While you can integrate the two, it's not really necessary. Again, it's a case where I could see it self-balancing in a multiplayer match, trading mobility for damage, but it's a balance that's harder to maintain against such ineffectual enemies. And having played both back-to-back, I can see the ways Wanted Dead tried to improve on the formula, with melee combat demanding slightly more thought than in the former, but it makes certain decisions seem more strange as well. Given that taking damage was basically inevitable thanks to the hit-scan weapons enemies had, the regenerating health of Devil's Third ended up being a pretty serviceable inclusion. You were going to take damage, but it wasn't a huge deal if you could break line of sight or close distance with the enemy. With the limited health you have in Wanted Dead, the prospect of rushing down enemies becomes much less appealing. Though admittedly, this is really only an issue if you take on the game's hardest difficulty, which removes the ability to recover some life when you perform an execution move. I doubt you're meant to take the mode that seriously, but it's another case where the game seems to demand enough from the player that they'll inevitably end up scrutinizing and having a growing awareness of the downsides of this kind of design. Something else I think that's worth considering is the push and pull of resources in other shooters that attempt this blend of action. On our discussion of the game, the point was brought up that a shooter like Vanquish is able to direct how and when you use your melee attacks to cost your entire meter.
Yeah, thrusters. Might as well put a big spoiler on the damn thing.
Incredibly powerful, but very risky, and so you have to really consider how to use it. Only going in for your close range attacks if you're totally certain of its success, or if something has gone horribly wrong. On the other hand, and bear with me, a title like Oni makes ammo for your ranged weapons fairly scarce, and so the inverse is true. You have to think pretty carefully about when and where to use guns, and adapt to their unusual quirks. It gives the combat some real definition, reevaluating if it's worth it to end the fight that much faster at the cost of some ammo, or potentially having to draw from a different resource, your healing items, by taking on enemies melee only. Wanted Dead exists somewhere right in the middle of these two extremes, but I think it does so to its detriment. You can see how the pieces should fit together, building meter by attacking enemies in close range and picking off high priority targets from a distance, but it does not come together in execution. To mention the approach to healing again, where your limited medkit should help focus your playstyle, all it really does in practice is highlight how randomly you can lose an entire health bar. Taken all together, the combat design ends up being sort of shapeless. Or, to put it another way,
you just run to an enemy and you kill them the fastest way you can, right? That's all you do. It sounds so simplistic, but that actually is what the game is.
But I will say, for as much as I think these games are good examples of balancing these two approaches, it probably speaks to the difficulty of blending these gameplay styles that, for all their merits, Vanquish still gets labeled as a cover shooter by many, and I think I'm one of the 5 people on the planet who really enjoys Oni. Finding that balance and creating a space where players feel encouraged to draw from their full kit seems to be a steep challenge, so it does make some of the shortcomings of Wanted Dead more understandable. And to be fair, there is some potential here. One moment that I think sort of works is the fight against August, which is probably the best blending of all the systems in the game. You have to do a little bit of shooting and melee combat, but without solely relying on one or the other. Chase him down and he'll stop you in your tracks with a volley of shots. Try to zone him out and shoot him, and you'll end up using all your ammo. It's the closest the game comes to combining all its disparate elements, and seems like a decent basis to draw from. Make a few versatile enemies that could force you into different engagement ranges on the fly. I don't even think August represents that high a bar for boss design, but he's a standout in this game simply because he gets you to draw on and can withstand both sides of the combat. It's telling that of the other bosses in Wanted Dead, 2 of them basically omit one side of the combat or the other, and the other 2, which do let you use the full extent of your abilities, seem like they weren't tuned at all to respond to a ranged approach. There are a few ninja enemies that seem like the other best example of this balanced design, coming across as the most complete threat in the game with a kit that rivals yours, with range attacks and a lethal gap closer. These not only offer what I think are the most substantial encounters, but seem like the best chance to invite the player to freely use their own full range of moves. Again, the rest of the enemies fit pretty comfortably into the standard shooter mold, never pushing you into the kinds of scenarios that would really complement the mechanics on offer. But that sort of baggage informs so much of the game, I think. And there's maybe something to be said for the way they're contextualized too. Part of why I think Stage 2 works is that it's the one level where you're fighting androids, a conceit that does a great deal to complement the uncanny behavior of the enemies you're fighting. The enemy roster in the rest of the game just does not register as human. And a shift in the story, that you were fighting back against a synthetic army, could have been a decent way of masking some of the shortcomings present here. It could have also really opened up the gunplay to the kinds of positional damage seen in other shooters that would be too grim and unbelievable on human opponents. I imagine a more successful blending of these two systems would probably lean into the exaggerated hit reactions you get from those sorts of inhuman enemies. Another byproduct of creating a title that's backwards compatible with modern shooters seems to be including AI allies that mostly contribute by serving as distractions to enemies. I'm generally more open to these kinds of interactions than many players, but it's hard not to see them as contributing to the overall thoughtlessness of the action. I certainly wondered if the game would have fared better by being forced to design encounters with solely the player in mind, than just wade through the current team-based chaos of some of these fights. And this chaos isn't helped at all by one of the most antagonistic cameras in recent memory. It feels serendipitous to mention the relationship between camera and level design in the previous video, because this is the first time, in a long time, where the toughest challenge is the prospect of guiding the camera through some of these cramped areas. In so doing, it serves as another example as to why so many action games need to take place in a series of big gray cubes, anything else being a recipe for total disorientation. You can also see some of the additional issues with trying to blend two styles of gameplay together here. The later melee sections being made especially confusing thanks to the claustrophobic environments that would probably be fine if the game was just a shooter, and the over-the-shoulder camera being so zoomed in that you have no situational awareness, and so you end up in this paranoid dance of dodging around for fear of getting blindsided and losing your entire health bar. Definitely a place where stronger audio cues for enemy attacks or some UI warning could have taken up the slack. And most crucially, I was left with the feeling that the most compelling aspect of the combat had been less severely underdeveloped, as I saw the most potential in the way you could chain execution attacks together. Use your super move or cause multiple enemies to stagger, and stone will automatically kill every enemy in the area. A great feeling interaction when you pull it off. Pushing this concept could have given the game some real identity, trying to set up as many enemies as possible before executing an entire room to add to a theoretical scoring system. Maybe even keeping one alive so you can capitalize on the invincibility these moves provide. And to the point of a scoring system, I've recommended them as a way of tying together combat systems before, but here more than anywhere else, it might help bring some of the aforementioned problems to the forefront and demand that they be solved. If something like your damage taken was being tracked and scored against you, it might bring into focus some of the suspect arena design, the lack of telegraphing on certain enemy attacks, and some of the other strange interactions that can make the game so frustrating to play through. And maybe it's a moot point, as this chaining system is likely a side of the combat most players won't even see, given how a number of your execution moves are locked behind the game's progression system. Anecdotally, one trend that seems to be a Cited staple at this point is that so many of your fundamentals are buried in the skill tree, which comes off as less a way of meaningfully developing your character, and more as a weak way of adding an artificial sense of mastery. I'm not a fan of these progression systems anyway, but they seem particularly unflattering when they entail cutting up your character's kit and selling it back to you, with only the last hour or so giving you the range of moves you really should have had from minute 1. For example, in that August fight that I mentioned earlier, I kind of hated it initially, not having bought extra health or unlocked the finishers that would help cut through the horde of enemies at the beginning of the encounter. Maybe it's a skill issue or whatever, or you could argue it's entirely in keeping with so many action games that lock basic abilities behind a store, but I think it makes Wanted Dead unnecessarily off-putting, especially if you're being sold more on the game's cast and tone. Reworking the system so that the player abilities were unlocked from the start and you were getting currency to spend on weapon upgrades and the various minigames could have been a better approach, making those extra activities and more negligible bits of customization more connected with the rest of the game, and letting Wanted Dead start off with a better first impression. And I suppose it really stands out in the game pitching itself as a love letter to the 6th generation, instead feeling like a much more modern inclusion. This sense is maybe the most disappointing aspect for me as well. I've wanted to cover stuff I didn't immediately have the words for, that would show me something new, but there's not a huge gulf between this and many of the AAA games I've already talked about, at least in terms of the cohesiveness of their design. Instead of a focused experience, it's diluted by having to share space with all these other ideas, and overcome by the sense that it was never given the comprehensive look and extra time that could have allowed the team to tie certain elements here together. Even if so many of my issues can be framed as affectionate callbacks that are entirely in keeping for a game that's meant to be a love letter to old PS2 titles that were pulpy and dumb, I think this still falls annoyingly short. So, I'll leave you with a few stray thoughts to percolate on. It's sort of beyond the scope of this video, but I also wonder a great deal about the ambitions of the stories of Devil's Third and Wanted Dead, given how they lead in with these high-concept geopolitical conflicts, with questions of drone warfare and automated workers.
Labor shortages as they struggle to hire amid a wreck.
Gower today introduced the drone, a breakthrough humanoid artificial worker.
Obviously very pulpy, but they have these big ideas that are really only used to give you some hallways to shoot through. That's true of most games, I guess, but it feels like another case where these games play out in a far too familiar way. It's a small thing, but I like the idea of your pistol as a light attack / opener for engagements. The one addition that might help the game here is including a penalty reload animation if you used it too much in a short period of time, akin to the dodge in Bayonetta.
You want to touch me?
This might help to curb how viable it is to zone some of the tougher enemies and wear them down, but otherwise, the flow of using your pistol to stagger in close distance with them is probably one of the best feeling interactions in the game. One final thing, I think it's odd that Wanted Dead includes a pretty extensive licensed soundtrack that isn't used in any of the larger fight scenes. More style wouldn't offset some of the mechanical issues here, but this is a game that needed real moments as much as anything else. Like, how are you going to use a cover of Maniac in a cutscene, but not here? Anyway, I think the promise of these kinds of games is in their potential to take those bold swings, jettison the baggage that would come from creating a tempo release that has to graft every popular idea into its design, but instead much of the potential here seems to have been siphoned off onto distractions that hardly matter, and away from a conflicted combat system that has moments of excellence. Wanted Dead shouldn't have bothered with the extraneous stuff, and instead focused on the fundamentals and expanded on the qualities that are totally its own. Make a game that can cut straight to the heart. Thanks for watching.